Go. Good morning, Bruno.
Hey Nick, how are you?
Fine, thanks, and you.
Good.
Good. Another episode of PLA, and we're going to do the first question with you, Bruno. So, continuing on some of the negotiations or discussions that we've had in the last couple of weeks, we're dealing with student leases. We're dealing with them in depth and the various aspects of student leases. And so, today, what we're going to move on to is something that should be definitely kept in mind if you are an investor, if you're going into a student leases, and that is unfortunately the fact that students sometimes are not the best at looking after properties, at caring for them. And so, as an investor, we want to discuss a little bit about what do you do when you're going to get into a student lease? What do you need to anticipate? What do you need to look out for to make sure that you don't lose your investment as a result of damage on the property?
Damage to a property under leasing circumstances obviously happens across the board. It's not something that a landlord can say that he's never experienced, especially if he's been in the industry for quite a number of years. Now, in the student space, we do find that this happens quite frequently, and believe it or not, the solutions don't differ all that much from what you'd find in the normal rental space. But it is something that you need to bear in mind because it does happen quite frequently, especially in student accommodation. Unfortunately, students do not always take care of premises, and it is very, very important that you mitigate these risks in the right way. So the first thing to bear in mind is when we speak about the condition of the property and damage to the property, one has to distinguish between normal wear and tear and actual damage to the property. Because remember, under leases, if a person hands over a property for somebody else to hire and utilize and enjoy, part of the consideration that they're paying for that includes a certain amount of fair wear and tear. So the landlord does retain some responsibility when it comes down to ensuring that the property stays in a certain condition. If it's fair wear and tear, the landlord has to cover these type of expenses. So over a number of years, you'll find, for example, that carpets might fade, or even the paint on the walls might fade in color and might not be as bright. Things like that, as an example, may be considered fair wear and tear, and the landlord would be responsible for fixing these if he chooses to. Now, damage to the property is very different. So damage is usually defined as a certain act by someone that results in a loss or a damage to the property. Now, this act doesn't have to necessarily be intentional. It can be negligent as well. So, but you're looking for that specific act. So you're looking for an act where the tenant or a student, as an example, has not given a due care to the property and has allowed something to transpire that actually resulted in damage to the property. So stupid examples is there's a leak in the ceiling and the tenant is aware that there's a leak. They can hear it or they can see some sort of damage, but they leave it because it's not their problem, not their property, so they allow it to happen. We've seen, for example, in situations where something might break and the tenant doesn't report it, so a gate is left open and unlocked because the lock broke and the tenant says nothing about it and leaves it open and allows vandals to come into the property. Obviously, the most common ones are drain issues where, the drain gets packed with food or hair or whatever the case is, causes blockages, and then eventually results in a massive, pipe, leak or a pipe bursting or a blockage or something along those lines, when the tenant was very much aware that they should have acted reasonably. And then obviously there's the intentional damage. This as a landlord, I'm hoping that you don't experience frequently. This is normally out of animosity or anger, but under intentional circumstances, people, like in one of my YouTube videos where I think one of the viewers found it amusing to mention that if, he damages properties by taking a sledgehammer to a kitchen sink and by leaving graffiti and pouring bleach on the carpets. This is obviously an act of some aggression, but it does happen. In any case, so those are the type of damages you may find as a landlord, which is distinguished from normal wear and tear, which as a landlord you're expected to take care of. Now, what are the solutions to these problems, and are there any special solutions that apply to student accommodation as opposed to normal residential accommodation? So some typical things to speak about is lease terms. Make very sure in the lease agreement that the obligations of the tenant are very well defined. Well defined. Lease agreements should not read so abstractly or openly that no one actually quite understands what their responsibilities are. And it makes it sound like everything is their responsibility, because then people don't actually give attention to this. They don't respect it. So you have to be quite specific. And I often suggest that people do this by giving a document, like a handover document, to a tenant, especially students, and especially when people are sharing certain common areas. I always suggest that the landlord does a tenant pack. And in this tenant pack, you take certain things from the lease and you summarize it for the tenant's own convenience, but for yours as well. So you can actually tell the tenant, listen, just so you know, the lease agreement requires that you do this. So for example, the swimming pool. The swimming pool is your responsibility. You have to buy chlorine, and you have to maintain the swimming pool, because the lease agreement is quite broad on this topic. So we're bringing it into a language that you understand, that makes it crystal clear that this is your responsibility. And you can't come later and argue, because contractually the lease agreement does already provide for this. So clear language in the lease makes it easy. Or in a landlord pack that takes the content from the lease and explains it to the tenant so they understand what their responsibilities are. People get confused all the time with whether they need to, take care of the carpets, clean the carpets, take care of the garden, take care of the swimming pool. These are all very confusing, and tenants often don't know it's their responsibility. The air cons, cleaning the filters, that sort of thing, preventing blockage of drainage. Have this conversation and explain the rules quite simply, and even give examples of things people should not put down the drain, because guess what? Intuition, you assume that everyone walks around with a certain amount of intuition, and you would be wrong. So please make sure that you take away that assumption and you list it clear as day what your expectation is. So that's the first one. Second one, deposit. This is common. I'm not going to speak about it a lot, but if you've got a deposit, 1 month, 2 months, whatever it is, good for you, because anything does happen to the property, and provided it's not completely trashed and an absolute fortune to fix, usually your 1 month's deposit would be enough to cover small little things, painting and that sort of thing. So make sure you hold a deposit, and remember, again, in the lease pack, the last month's rent cannot be held back because there's a deposit. And everyone asked me this quite innocently, where tenants just, oh, okay, you know what, I'm going to move out, so I just won't pay this month's rent because they have my deposit. And consistently, you have to explain to individuals that that is not the way that it works. The deposit is not there to cover your last month's rent. The deposit is there to cover potential damage to the property. And if the property is not damaged, you have to give this deposit back. So also, as a landlord, have some integrity, because if you start creating this precedent, guess what happens? The tenant that doesn't get his deposit back because now you refuse to pay it back and you make up damages, he's going to go to another property and he's going to treat that landlord badly. And it creates this kind of vicious circle. And that's why now we sit with tenants not wanting to pay a last month's rent, because they're more fearful of the landlord not actually returning their deposit. So be very careful in the beast that you create. So that's a deposit. The next one would be the suretyship, which I discussed last week as well, where if you're worried that the student has not shown adequate credibility, make sure that the parents do, because anything happens to the property, guess who you're going to be phoning? Yes, it sounds very high school-like, but, telling on works. So you figure out that something's happening here on the property, you pick up that phone and you ask for a parent-student meeting, and you explain to the parent what's going wrong. And more often than not, this actually does help, because they might not respect you, but many times they fear their parents. Inspections. Now, this is a very important one. With student accommodation, especially with shared areas, I would up the frequency of inspections. So we normally do this on a month-by-month basis, in fact, especially with multi-lets. So go there frequently, check out all the properties, start looking for signs that one property is being neglected, maybe the door's damaged, maybe you see through the window that something looks wrong. You can normally tell when something's going wrong. So the inspections, I feel, are absolute key. When it comes to an accommodation or multi-lets, inspect frequently, at least once a month. And I think insofar as damage to the property or condition of the property is concerned, these solutions, unfortunately, sometimes they don't always work. But if you're on top of everything and you implement each one of these, you're far less likely to suffer as much damage as you would, if you don't do these things.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you for that, Bruno.